The numbers couldn't be right. Colonel Friedrich Kellner read the intelligence report again, his coffee growing cold in the December morning air of his Berlin office. December 18, 1943. Outside, the city was waking to another day of rationing, another day of making do with less. Inside, Kellner was staring at figures that made no sense. The Americans were burning 18 million gallons of gasoline per month just teaching soldiers how to drive. Not in combat. Not moving supplies to the front. Just training. Teaching farm boys from Iowa how to handle a truck. Showing city kids from New York how to work a clutch. He set down the report and picked up another document. The fuel allocation for Army Group Center, the massive German force fighting desperately on the Eastern Front. 2 million gallons per month. For everything. Every tank, every truck, every motorcycle, every staff car. Every offensive, every retreat, every desperate kilometer gained or lost in the frozen hell of Russia. 2 million gallons to fight a war. 18 million gallons to teach Americans how to turn a steering wheel. The math was impossible, obscene, incomprehensible. It suggested something that no German officer wanted to consider, that America was operating on a scale of resources so vast that they could afford to burn in training exercises what Germany needed to survive. That they could waste more fuel teaching a teenager to parallel park a jeep than the Wehrmacht used to move entire divisions. That this war was already over, decided not on battlefields but in oil fields, measured not in courage but in gallons, determined not by strategy but by the simple, brutal mathematics of who had fuel and who didn't. Kellner walked to his window and looked out at Berlin's streets. A few vehicles moved slowly, carefully, preserving every drop of precious fuel. Horses pulled wagons that had once been pulled by trucks. Officers who once had staff cars now rode bicycles. And somewhere across the Atlantic, American 18-year-olds were burning through more gasoline in driver training than Rommel had used in entire African campaigns. The thought made him feel something he never felt before in his career, not fear of defeat, but the vertigo of realizing you're fighting an enemy that exists in a completely different universe of possibility. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe so these hidden truths live on. The revelation had started with a captured American training manual found in Sicily in August 1943. It outlined the standard driver training course for U.S. Army personnel, 240 hours of instruction, including 60 hours of actual driving time per trainee. The German intelligence officer who first read it assumed it was a mistranslation. 60 hours of driving for basic training? The Wehrmacht allocated 6 hours, if that. Most German soldiers learn to drive by necessity, in combat, if they learn at all. But 60 hours of burning fuel just to create one barely competent driver? Then came more captured documents. Training schedules from Fort Knox showing armored divisions conducting exercises that consumed 400,000 gallons in a single week. A week. Not in combat against an enemy, but driving in circles around Kentucky, practicing formations that might never be used, burning fuel like it was water. The German analyst who compiled these reports added a note in the margin. If accurate, these figures represent a psychotic level of resource expenditure. Recommend verification as probable propaganda. But verification came, and it was worse than anyone imagined. Through neutral sources in Switzerland, through intercepted communications, through the testimonies of captured Americans who spoke casually, almost carelessly, about their training, the picture emerged of a mobilization so lavish with fuel that it defied European comprehension. The Americans weren't just training drivers. They were training them to a level of competence that assumed unlimited gasoline forever. Lieutenant James Patterson from Ohio, captured in Italy, told his interrogators about his training at Fort Benning. His testimony, recorded in Wehrmacht intelligence files, seemed like fantasy. We drove 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 2 months. If you stalled the engine, you started over. If you couldn't maintain convoy speed, extra hours. We burned through trucks, wore out engines, used so much gas the local filling stations complained we were draining the county dry. The instructors said it was better to waste gas in Georgia than blood in Europe. The German interrogator noted. Prisoner shows no awareness that his training consumed more fuel than most German units receive for combat operations. When informed of this, he appeared confused and asked, "Don't you guys have oil wells?" That was the heart of it. America had oil wells. America had the East Texas oil fields, producing millions of barrels. America had the refineries of New Jersey and Louisiana, running day and night. America had a fuel infrastructure that turned crude oil into gasoline into military power with an efficiency Germany could only dream of. But knowing this intellectually was different from seeing it manifest in such casual, almost insulting abundance. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, received a comprehensive brief on American fuel consumption in early 1944. His reaction was recorded by his aide. The general read the report in silence for 20 minutes. When he finished, he said simply, "Then we have already lost." When asked to elaborate, he explained, "An army that can spend 18 million gallons monthly on training can spend 50 million in combat. 100 million if pressed. We are not fighting the same war. We are rationing fuel by the liter while they measure it by the lake." The numbers became an obsession in German high command. Staff officers who should have been planning operations spent hours calculating and recalculating American fuel capacity. The figures were so staggering they seemed like mathematical errors. The U.S. Army was training 2 million drivers. 2 million. Each consuming an average of 800 gallons during their training period. That was 1.6 billion gallons just to create a pool of drivers, not counting combat, not counting logistics, not counting anything but the basic act of teaching Americans how to operate vehicles. Meanwhile, the entire German Afrika Korps, at the height of its operations, had operated on 30,000 gallons per day. The Americans were burning more than that every hour in training camps across Texas, California, and Georgia. They were consuming more fuel teaching privates how to reverse a truck than Germany used to supply the siege of Stalingrad. The German soldier's perspective was even more bitter. Corporal Hans Müller wrote to his wife from the Eastern Front in March 1944. "Today we waited 6 hours for fuel that never came. The tanks sit idle. The trucks are empty. We march on foot through mud that should be beneath our wheels." And Wolfgang, who was captured and returned in a prisoner exchange, tells us the Americans burn fuel for fun. They race jeeps for entertainment. They leave engines running to keep warm. They throw away more than we receive. I no longer believe we can win against such wealth. The psychological impact was devastating. German propaganda had told soldiers they were fighting soft, decadent Americans who couldn't match German discipline and efficiency. But what kind of discipline did you need when you had unlimited resources? What was the value of German efficiency when the Americans could afford to be gloriously, insanely inefficient, and still drown you in material superiority? The U.S. Army's approach to driver training was indeed revolutionary in its excess. At Fort Bliss, Texas, the 1st Armored Division's training program consumed 2.3 million gallons in 8 weeks of exercises. They practiced the same maneuvers repeatedly, burning fuel to build muscle memory, to create drivers who could operate vehicles in their sleep, under fire, in any condition. They deliberately drove vehicles to mechanical failure to teach maintenance under stress. They had demolition derbies with obsolete equipment to teach aggressive driving. They burned fuel like armies burn ammunition, lavishly, almost carelessly, with the confidence of infinite resupply. Major Robert Chin, who helped design the training programs, explained the philosophy decades later. "We figured a gallon of gas in training might save a pint of blood in combat. So we burned gas. We burned it teaching kids who'd never driven anything bigger than a tractor how to handle a Sherman tank. We burned it running the same convoy exercises hundreds of times until they could maintain intervals in their sleep. We burned it because we could, and because somewhere a German tank crew was counting their last liters." Support this work so the truth continues to reach people. The Germans tried to adapt. They instituted even stricter fuel rationing. They developed wood-gas vehicles that ran on charcoal. They trained horses to pull anti-tank guns. They invented the word Kraftstoffnot, fuel emergency, which became a constant state rather than an exceptional crisis. But how do you adapt to an enemy that treats your entire fuel allocation as a rounding error? The disparity created surreal situations. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, German forces captured an American fuel depot containing 250,000 gallons of gasoline. The German commanders literally couldn't believe it. 250,000 gallons, just sitting there, waiting to be distributed to American units. It was more fuel than some German divisions had seen in 6 months. The German offensive, already desperate, became partly a raid for gasoline. Tigers and Panthers, the most feared tanks in the world, were abandoned not because they were destroyed but because they ran dry, while American Shermans never stopped moving, fed by an endless stream of fuel that flowed from America to Europe like a pipeline of liquid victory. Captain Ernst Hoffmann, a German logistics officer, wrote in his journal, "The Americans have democratized warfare. Every soldier is motorized. Every private expects to ride. They have eliminated the ancient distinction between those who march and those who ride. And they did it by burning oceanic quantities of fuel. We are fighting the past against the future, and the future runs on gasoline we don't have." The training programs kept expanding. By mid-1944, the U.S. Army was operating 16 major driver training centers in the continental United States. Camp Roberts in California alone had 3,000 vehicles in constant operation, consuming 100,000 gallons per day. The exhaust fumes were so thick that local residents complained their crops were dying. The Army's response was to pay compensation and keep training. Nothing could stop the machine that turned civilians into drivers into military power. The contrast with German training was stark. A captured German training directive from 1944 allocated 50 liters, about 13 gallons, per trainee for driver instruction. Total. The same document noted that actual allocation was often half that. German drivers learned the basics and finished their education in combat, if they survived. They learned fuel economy as a survival skill, coasting down hills with engines off, pushing vehicles to save the last drops for combat. Meanwhile, American trainees were taught to never worry about fuel consumption. Keep the engine running, was doctrine. Cold start? Waste of time. Engine wear from idling? Cheaper than combat delays. The U.S. Army calculated that it was more economical to burn fuel continuously than to risk mechanical failures from temperature cycles. This philosophy would have been insane in any other army. In the U.S. Army, it was standard operating procedure. The numbers tell the story in stark relief. In 1944, the U.S. Army consumed approximately 600 million gallons of gasoline. The training establishment alone, not combat forces, just training, consumed 145 million gallons. The entire German Wehrmacht, all fronts, all operations, consumed approximately 180 million gallons. The Americans burned nearly as much teaching soldiers to drive as Germany used fighting a two-front war. The German realization of this disparity created a crisis of confidence that went beyond military calculations. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel wrote, "We are not merely outproduced. We exist in different realities. We measure fuel in liters saved, they measure it in oceans spent. We cannot compete with an enemy that trains on a scale we cannot fight at." Individual stories illuminate the vast gulf. Private Tony Martinez from Los Angeles trained at Fort Hood, Texas, in 1943. His 8-week training course consumed approximately 1,200 gallons of gasoline. In the same period, Panzer Commander Otto Carius, one of Germany's greatest tank aces, fought 17 engagements on the Eastern Front with a total fuel allocation of 600 gallons. An American private learning to drive used twice as much fuel as a German ace fighting for his nation's survival. The American training system produced extraordinary results. By 1945, the U.S. Army had approximately 2.5 million qualified drivers, more than the total number of vehicles in all other armies combined. These drivers could operate everything from motorcycles to tank transporters, in any weather, in any terrain. They'd been trained to drive at night without lights, to maintain convoy discipline under fire, to perform basic maintenance under combat conditions. They'd learned these skills by burning fuel at rates that would have supplied entire German operations. The quality showed in combat. American units maintained mobility even in the worst conditions. During the race across France in 1944, American divisions covered distances that German doctrine considered impossible, not because American vehicles were better but because every American soldier could drive, maintain, and if necessary, repair any vehicle in the motor pool. This universal motorization, bought with billions of gallons of training fuel, created a flexibility and speed that German forces couldn't match even when they had fuel. Lieutenant Colonel Hans von Luck, a German officer who fought against Americans in Africa, Italy, and France, observed, "The American soldier was not necessarily braver or better trained in combat than ours. But he could drive anything with wheels or tracks. When their tanks broke down, tank crews became truck drivers. When trucks were destroyed, drivers became tank crew. This interchangeability, this universal mechanical competence, was a weapon we hadn't anticipated." The fuel consumption patterns revealed something deeper about American military culture. The U.S. Army didn't just have more resources, it had a different conception of what war meant. German military tradition emphasized warrior virtues, courage, endurance, tactical brilliance. American military doctrine emphasized systems, logistics, standardization, overwhelming material superiority. The gasoline consumption was just one manifestation of this philosophy. Why be brilliant when you can be abundant? This abundance created its own problems. American units were so dependent on motorization that when fuel supplies were interrupted, they often became paralyzed. German units, trained to operate on nothing, could maintain combat effectiveness even without fuel. But those interruptions were rare. The American supply system, the famous Red Ball Express and its successors, delivered fuel with a reliability that seemed supernatural to German observers. German intelligence tried desperately to find weak points in the American fuel system. They studied pipeline routes, refinery locations, tanker schedules. But the scale defeated them. How do you interdict a supply system that delivers millions of gallons daily? How do you attack infrastructure that stretches from Texas oil fields to French fuel depots, protected by the world's largest navy and air force? How do you fight an enemy that can lose entire fuel convoys and not even notice? The most telling statistic came from a post-war analysis. In 1944 to 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe lost approximately 50 million gallons of fuel to German action, submarine attacks, air raids, sabotage. It was one of Germany's most successful interdiction campaigns. The American response was to increase shipments by 75 million gallons to ensure no operational impact. They covered their losses and added a margin for safety. The German success had literally no effect on American operations. General Omar Bradley, reflecting on logistics after the war, said, "We won with overwhelming firepower and unlimited mobility. Both depended on fuel. We trained our men to expect abundance, and they fought with the confidence abundance brings. The Germans fought brilliantly with scarcity, but scarcity can only take you so far against an enemy who measures fuel in oceans." The German military attaché in Madrid, who had access to neutral intelligence sources, sent a final assessment to Berlin in March 1945. "The American fuel consumption in training alone exceeds our combat consumption by a factor of 9. This is not a disparity that can be overcome by courage, tactics, or technology. We are fighting an enemy that exists in a different economic universe. Recommend immediate consideration of any peace terms available." The recommendation was ignored, but the reality it described was inescapable. As German forces ran out of fuel in the final months of the war, abandoning vehicles, marching on foot, reverting to horse-drawn transport, American forces accelerated. They drove faster, further, with more vehicles than ever. The contrast was absolute. One army returning to the 19th century while the other raced into the future on rivers of gasoline. Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again. The full magnitude of American fuel consumption in World War II wasn't understood until years after the conflict. The numbers were so large they seemed abstract, meaningless. But for those who lived through it, who fought in it, who watched it unfold, the meaning was clear. Wars are won by many factors: courage, leadership, strategy. But in the industrial age, they're also won by resources, and no resource was more decisive than fuel. The Germans knew how to fight. They'd proven it in Poland, France, Russia. They had better tanks, often better tactics, frequently better positions. But they were fighting the last war, a war where individual excellence could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans were fighting a new war, one where industrial might multiplied by logistical efficiency created a form of power that traditional military virtues couldn't match. A German veteran, interviewed in the 1970s, captured it perfectly. "We were warriors. They were engineers. We fought battles. They managed systems. We counted bullets. They counted oceans of fuel. We were brave. They were infinite. How do you defeat infinite?" The training camps kept running until the very end. On May 7, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, the U.S. Army Driver Training Center at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, consumed 67,000 gallons of gasoline teaching the final class of drivers for a war that was ending. They didn't know the war was over. Or perhaps they did and finished the training anyway, because that's what the system did. It trained, it consumed, it produced, with a mechanical certainty that ground down any opposition. The last German report on American fuel consumption was never completed. Found in abandoned Wehrmacht headquarters, it was a half-finished analysis of American training methods. The final line, written in pencil, possibly added by someone other than the original author, reads, "They have made war into an industrial process. We never had a chance." In the decades after the war, military historians would debate strategy, tactics, leadership, technology. But ask any German officer who served on the Western Front what defeated them, and many would give the same answer: gasoline. Not just the lack of it on their side, but the absurd, impossible, overwhelming abundance of it on the American side. The fact that Americans could burn 18 million gallons a month just teaching teenagers to drive while German tank crews were siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles, measuring it by the cup, burning furniture for fuel oil, pushing their vehicles to save the last drops for combat. The U.S. Army's official history records that between 1941 and 1945, American military driver training programs consumed approximately 2.8 billion gallons of gasoline. This figure doesn't include combat operations, logistics, or any other military activity. Just training. Just teaching Americans to drive military vehicles. It was more fuel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined used for all military operations throughout the entire war. The ghost of that consumption still haunts military doctrine. Modern armies study the American example, trying to understand how such lavish expenditure and training translated to combat effectiveness. The answer isn't complicated. When you train with unlimited resources, you fight with unlimited confidence. When every soldier knows how to drive, maintain, and operate any vehicle, your entire force becomes flexible, adaptable, unstoppable. When fuel is infinite in training, it feels infinite in combat, and that feeling, that confidence in abundance, is itself a weapon. The German shock at American fuel consumption wasn't just about numbers. It was about encountering a civilization that had transcended traditional limitations, that had made the impossible routine. They were shocked that Americans spent more on training than Germany used in combat. But the real shock was deeper, the realization that they were fighting an enemy for whom such expenditure wasn't even remarkable, just standard procedure, just the way things were done. Wars are not only fought with bullets and courage. They're fought with the silent rivers of fuel that power empires, with the boring statistics of consumption that determine who moves and who stays still, who advances and who retreats, who trains in abundance and who fights in scarcity. In that quiet war of resources, Germany brought buckets to fight an ocean. The training fields of Texas and Georgia and California, where American teenagers burned through lakes of gasoline learning to work a clutch, those were the real battlefields of World War II. Every wasted gallon in training was a German tank that couldn't move, a German division that couldn't retreat, a German offensive that couldn't begin. The war was won in those training fields, measured in gallons burned by boys who didn't yet know they were learning to operate the machines that would crush an empire. Stand today at what was once Fort Hood or Fort Benning, and you can still smell it sometimes, the ghost of all that burned gasoline, the phantom exhaust of a million training exercises, the residue of abundance that won a war. The Germans were shocked that Americans spent more gasoline on training drivers than Germany used on the entire front. They should have been. It was the shock of meeting a future they couldn't imagine, powered by resources they couldn't match, driven by drivers trained in impossible abundance. The war ended, but the lesson remains. In modern conflict, the side that can afford to waste the most in training will likely waste the least in blood. The Americans understood this. They burned oceans of fuel to save lives, spent billions of gallons to buy victory, measured success not in efficiency but in overwhelming, almost absurd abundance. And in the end, that abundance, shocking, wasteful, impossible abundance, wrote the final chapter of the war. Not with dramatic battles or brilliant strategies, but with the simple, brutal mathematics of who had fuel and who didn't, who could train in plenty and who fought in want, who measured gasoline by the gallon and who measured it by the drop. The echo of those training engines still reverberates through history, the sound of abundance defeating scarcity, of industrial might overwhelming warrior virtue, of an empire that could afford to burn more fuel teaching farm boys to drive than its enemies used trying to conquer the world.